What happens when the weapon you built for 20 years suddenly stops working all at once in the middle of a real fight? Iran was about to find out, and nobody in Tehran saw it coming. Before we go any further, hit that like button right now, because this story only gets crazier from here and you don't want to miss a second of it. If you're new here, subscribe, because we break down modern military stories like this every single week. And if this blows your mind even a little, send it to one person who needs to see it too. For almost 2 decades, Iran built its entire navy around one simple idea. You don't need the biggest ships if you have the most boats. Small, fast, cheap, and everywhere at once. That was the plan. And for a long time, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Picture the Persian Gulf. Narrow waters, hundreds of hidden coves, small islands scattered like stepping stones across the Strait of Hormuz. Iran looked at all of that and saw an opportunity nobody else wanted to use. They couldn't build aircraft carriers. They couldn't match the United States ship for ship. So they didn't try. Instead, they built swarms. It's actually a pretty old idea dressed up in modern technology. Small, cheap forces have always looked for ways to punish bigger, more expensive ones. But Iran had something most smaller navies never had, a narrow, congested waterway that practically every warship in the region had to pass through eventually. That geography turned a weaker force into a genuine threat, because you don't need to win a fair fight when the water itself is working in your favor. Dozens, sometimes over 100 small speedboats, some carrying rockets, some carrying torpedoes, some rigged to explode on contact like floating bombs with a single purpose. Each boat on its own means nothing. A warship could sink one in seconds. But that was never the point. The point was numbers. Throw 50 boats at a single ship from every direction at once, and even the most advanced radar system in the world starts to struggle. Too many targets, too many angles, too little time to react. It's a simple idea, but it's a smart one. A single destroyer can only track and fire at so many things at the same time. Overload that system, and you create chaos. And chaos in naval warfare is exactly what a smaller, weaker force wants. Iran didn't just build this quietly, either. They showed it off. Year after year, state television aired footage of dozens of boats racing across open water in tight, twisting formations, weaving past each other like a single living organism. The message was simple: come into our waters, and this is what waits for you. And this wasn't just for show, it happened for real, more than once. American destroyers sailing through international waters found themselves suddenly surrounded by Iranian fast boats, weapons uncovered, radios silent, closing the distance until American sailors had to sound horns just to keep them from coming any closer. These weren't rare, isolated events. They happened again and again over the years, enough times that the world stopped being surprised by them. So Iran kept building. Each new generation of boats got faster than the last, 55 knots, then 75, then 90, with plans already in motion for boats that could hit over 110. They loaded them with better weapons. They built their own radar network so the whole swarm could talk to each other without depending on outside systems that could be jammed or shut down. This wasn't some side project buried in a random shipyard. This was the heart of Iran's entire naval strategy. Billions of dollars, years of planning, all built around one single idea: overwhelm them with numbers before they even know what's happening. So when the current conflict actually broke out earlier this year, Iran didn't hesitate. They pulled the trigger on everything they had built. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important waterways on the planet, the place where a huge share of the world's oil physically has to pass through, was slammed shut. And Iran didn't just close it with boats. They backed it up with 3 layers of defense, stacked one on top of the other. First, sea mines, quietly, planted along the ocean floor, waiting. Second, the swarm itself, fast boats positioned to encircle and harass anything that dared to move through the water. And third, hidden deep in the mountains along the northern coastline, underground missile sites, built to survive almost anything, holding long-range anti-ship missiles as a final layer of insurance in case the boats alone weren't enough. On paper, this was a nightmare to solve. 3 separate threats working together, mines that could sink a ship without warning, boats that could swarm from every direction, and missiles that could strike from miles away, even if you somehow dealt with the boats. Normal shipping through the strait, which usually sees well over 100 vessels a day, collapsed almost overnight. Insurance companies pulled out. Shipping companies rerouted entire fleets or simply stopped moving cargo altogether. For a brief moment, it actually looked like Iran had pulled it off. Their doctrine, the one they had spent 20 years building, was working exactly the way it was designed to. Cargo ships sat anchored offshore for days, captains waiting for word on whether it was even safe to move. Oil prices twitched with every new report out of the region. For the rest of the world, this wasn't some distant military story playing out on the news. It was fuel prices climbing, supply chains stretching thinner, and a very real reminder of just how much of daily life depends on ships being able to pass through one narrow stretch of water without getting blown up. And then something happened that Iran's entire strategy never accounted for, because here's the truth about a plan built entirely around overwhelming human beings. It only works if there are human beings to overwhelm. And the moment you remove that limitation, the entire plan collapses. For years, quietly, almost invisibly, the United States Navy had been building something most people had never even heard of. Not a bigger gun, not a bigger missile, something much smarter. A way to fight the swarm without ever putting a single sailor in the middle of it. Meet the boat that changed everything. It's called the Global Autonomous Reconnaissance Craft, or GAR-C for short, built by a company most people outside the defense world have never heard of. And honestly, at first glance, it doesn't look like much. 16 feet long, weighs about as much as a small truck, powered by a modest 200 horsepower engine. It doesn't look like the future of naval warfare. It looks like a fishing boat, but it doesn't need a crew, it doesn't get tired, it doesn't need sleep, food, or a shift change. It can sit on the water, watching, for hundreds of hours straight. During this exact conflict, these unmanned boats logged more than 450 hours on the water and covered over 2,200 nautical miles around the strait alone. Think about what that actually means. A watcher that never blinks, never looks away, never gets distracted for even a second. And it wasn't alone out there. Alongside it, the Navy deployed something even more dangerous. Unmanned strike boats built by a different company designed not just to watch, but to fight. And for the first time in the history of naval warfare, robotic boats were used as actual offensive weapons in real combat. Not a test, not a drill. Real strikes on real targets. In one coordinated wave, these unmanned vessels struck a major Iranian naval port directly. Separately, robotic boats were used to help take down an Iranian submarine. No sailors on board, no pilot risking their life. Just machines doing what machines are good at, without fear, without fatigue, without hesitation. Now picture the actual battlefield Iran's swarm boats suddenly found themselves in. Every hidden cove, every quiet inlet, every small island where boats used to gather in secret before racing out to surround a target. All of it, suddenly, sat under constant watch. Not from a satellite passing overhead once a day, not from a human crew that eventually needs rest, from machines that simply never stopped looking. Think about how much of Iran's confidence was built on timing, launch from a hidden cove at exactly the right moment, reach the target before a warning ever goes out, surround the ship before its crew can properly assess what's happening. That whole plan depends on a gap, a small window of confusion where the defender doesn't yet know what's coming. Take that gap away, and the entire plan changes shape. Suddenly, every boat that leaves a hidden cove is already being tracked before it even reaches open water. The element of surprise, the single most valuable ingredient in Iran's entire doctrine, simply stopped existing. And that's the part that broke Iran's entire doctrine. The swarm was never really about the boats themselves. It was about surprise. It was about overwhelming a defender's limited attention before they even knew what was happening. Take away the surprise, and the swarm isn't a threat anymore. It's just a target. All right, quick pause here. If you're finding this genuinely interesting, do me a favor and drop a comment right now telling me one word that describes how this story makes you feel. I read every single one, and it helps this video reach more people who'd love it too. Now let's keep going, because this next part is where things get even more intense. While the robotic boats were quietly rewriting the rules on the water, something else was happening in the sky above Iran's coastline. Because watching the boats was only half the problem. The other half was those underground missile sites, the ones built specifically to survive normal bombs. Decades-old tunnels, concrete silos buried so deep that ordinary weapons simply couldn't reach what was hidden inside. So the response wasn't ordinary. Massive bunker-busting bombs weighing thousands of pounds each, built with thick steel casings specifically designed to punch through dozens of feet of solid earth and reinforced concrete before exploding from the inside out. Not cratering the surface, collapsing the entire structure from within. The first real combat use of these exact weapons came against Iran's coastal missile sites earlier this year, and the results were about as decisive as it gets. Reports from military officials later confirmed that these strikes wiped out roughly 90% of Iran's missile stockpile along the entire coastline near the strait. Think about that number for a second. 90%. The long-range insurance policy Iran had built its entire strategy around. The backup plan in case the boats failed, gone in a matter of days. So now think about where that leaves Iran's swarm doctrine. The mines were being cleared, the missile sites were shattered, and the boats that had once been the pride of Iran's entire naval strategy, were suddenly alone, watched by machines that never slept, with nowhere left to hide. And this is where old-fashioned firepower came back into the story in a huge way. Because once you've stripped away a small boat's ability to hide and its ability to call in long-range missile support, you don't need anything exotic to finish the job. You just need an aircraft built specifically to hunt small, slow-moving targets close to the water. And there's really only one aircraft on Earth built for exactly that job. The A-10 Thunderbolt II. Slow, low, and armed with a cannon that fires nearly 4,000 rounds a minute. That kind of firepower can tear through a small boat's hull in seconds. And because the A-10 flies low and slow, exactly the opposite of what modern fighter jets are designed to do, it could keep Iranian boats under constant watch, denying them any chance to hide behind waves or slip into the coastline the way they'd trained to do for years. Attack helicopters joined in too, hunting down mobile missile batteries and smaller boats that tried to break away and sneak around behind the main group once the swarm started taking heavy losses. Advanced attack helicopters brought precision-guided missiles and their own onboard cannons into the fight, specifically hunting anything that tried to slip past the outer ring of unmanned watchers. Between the robotic boats watching everything, the bunker busters gutting the missile sites, and aircraft built specifically to hunt small targets at low altitude, Iran's swarm found itself fighting in a battlefield that had been completely reshaped against every single assumption its entire strategy was built on. Think about what it must have felt like from inside one of those boats. Trained for years to strike fast, vanish into a hidden cove, and reappear somewhere else before anyone could react. Suddenly, there was nowhere left to vanish to. Every cove had a watcher. Every inlet had a listener. The entire coastline that once felt like home field advantage had quietly turned into open ground with nowhere to hide. And here's the part that really deserves a moment of appreciation. This didn't take years. It didn't take months. It took days. Iran believed they had sealed the strait so completely that reopening it would be too costly, too chaotic, and too dangerous for anyone to even attempt. And in a matter of days, the exact system they had built to hold that choke point began falling apart, piece by piece, layer by layer, until the trap they thought they'd built turned into a battlefield where their most prized weapon simply couldn't function anymore. It's worth mentioning that this wasn't some rushed, last-minute idea either. The Navy had actually been quietly working on this exact problem for over a decade, long before this conflict ever started. Experimental laser weapons had already been tested on ships stationed in the Gulf years earlier, built specifically to answer the small boat swarm problem with something that costs almost nothing to fire compared to a multi-million-dollar missile. Early tests showed real promise, knocking out drones and small boats reliably during evaluation runs. Alongside that, engineers had also been working on smarter, more precise cannon rounds, giving ships a way to deal with small, fast boats without wasting expensive interceptor missiles on cheap targets. Both of these programs matured quietly in the background for years, mostly unnoticed, until this exact kind of swarm confrontation finally gave them a real battlefield to prove themselves on. Put it all together, and you start to see the real shape of what actually happened to Iran's swarm doctrine this year. It wasn't one single weapon that broke it. It was 6 or 7 different systems, developed separately over more than a decade, all maturing and converging at the exact same moment. Unmanned watchers, unmanned strikers, bunker-busting bombs, low altitude, attack aircraft, precision cannon rounds. Years of planning on how to connect all of it into a single, coordinated response. Any one of those pieces alone probably wouldn't have been enough to unravel 2 decades of doctrine. Together, deployed within days instead of months, they took it apart almost completely. Now, to be fair, Iran didn't just sit there and take it. This wasn't a one-sided story with no resistance at all. Iranian forces adapted in real time, and one of their adaptations was genuinely unsettling. Small wooden boats, the kind that look exactly like ordinary fishing vessels, secretly packed with explosives and turned into unmanned weapons themselves. Suddenly, every small boat on the water became a potential threat that had to be checked instead of ignored. That's a real problem, because it puts enormous pressure on exactly the kind of constant wide area watching that the robotic boats were designed to provide. There were confirmed attacks on actual commercial oil tankers using exactly this method. Boats that looked completely harmless right up until the moment they detonated. A tanker flying a foreign flag became one of the first ships hit this way, and more followed in the weeks after. So this fight wasn't purely one-directional. Iran leaned harder into deception once their open swarm tactics started failing, and it forced everyone involved to widen exactly what kind of small boats they had to treat as a genuine threat. And that's a genuinely uncomfortable trade-off for everyone involved, not just Iran. Every fisherman, every local trader, every innocent small boat suddenly became a question mark instead of a non-issue. That's the cost of an adversary willing to hide weapons inside ordinary life. It slows everyone down. It forces harder decisions. It puts more responsibility on the sensors and the software to tell the difference between a family heading home with a day's catch and a machine built to kill. That pressure is real, and it's exactly why persistent, always-on surveillance matters so much in this kind of fight. A human crew glancing at the water for a few seconds might miss the difference. A system that's been watching that same stretch of water for weeks, learning its normal patterns, has a much better chance of noticing when something doesn't belong. But here's the real problem with that adaptation, and it's the same problem hiding underneath basically every move Iran tried to make in this entire conflict. Disguising a boat as a fishing vessel might buy you a moment of surprise here and there, but it doesn't fix the deeper issue. Iran no longer controls what happens on that water. Every disguised boat that gets caught and stopped is one more asset Iran can't easily replace, especially with sanctions choking off the parts needed to build these systems in the first place. And every successful detection makes the next attempt at disguise less effective, because the same network watching the water is constantly learning what to look for. You simply cannot out-trick a robotic system that never stops watching and never stops updating what it knows, not when you're the one running out of boats to disguise. All right, if you're still here, I need you to do something. For me, real quick, tap that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because the next part of this story involves a full international coalition getting pulled into this fight, and you do not want to miss it. Okay, let's keep going. Because this wasn't just the United States acting alone. By the middle of this conflict, a group of major allies, including Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada, publicly pledged to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz for commercial shipping. A much larger group, over 20 nations, in total, expressed support for the effort, even if not every single one sent forces immediately. Britain became one of the most active partners in that group, fitting support ships with their own autonomous mine-hunting drones specifically designed to locate and safely disable sea mines from a distance, directly targeting that first layer of Iran's strategy. They also sent a modern destroyer into the region and provided base support for ongoing operations. So by the time this campaign hit full stride, it wasn't just America against Iran anymore. It was a genuinely international effort, combining American robotic boats and precision airpower with allied mine-clearing technology and additional ships, all converging on the exact same choke point at the exact same time. That's an important detail people tend to overlook, and this wasn't just about one country's technology winning a fight. It was about a shared global interest, keeping one of the most important waterways on the planet open, pulling together a coalition fast enough and coordinated enough to actually make a difference within days instead of dragging on for years. When a fifth of the world's oil moves through a single narrow strip of water, closing it isn't just a regional problem. It's a problem for factories in Germany, shipping companies in Japan, and gas prices at a station near you, wherever you are. That's exactly why so many nations moved so quickly once the strait actually shut down. It's worth understanding exactly why those small robotic watcher boats caused such a massive problem for Iranian planners once they were deployed at real scale. Because their value goes far beyond simply having eyes on the water. These boats were built for endurance, not speed or firepower. A design specifically meant to sit quietly, patiently watching for as long as it takes. That kind of boat is perfect for shadowing fast attack craft from a distance, checking out suspicious movement before it ever gets close enough to matter, and instantly alerting manned ships or aircraft the moment something worth acting on shows up. It's not a one-time weapon that disappears after a single use. It's a permanent set of eyes that never has to go home. And unlike a manned patrol boat, losing one of these doesn't cost a life. It barely costs a headline. That single fact changes the entire economics of the fight. A commander can afford to be aggressive with a machine in a way they could never afford to be with a crewed vessel, push it closer, send it into a riskier position, let it linger somewhere dangerous for just a little longer to confirm what's really out there. None of that requires anyone to weigh the value of a human life against the value of information. That kind of freedom completely changes how a defender can operate, and it's a freedom Iran's swarm boats, crewed by real people with real families waiting for them, could never truly match. And none of this appeared out of nowhere the moment this conflict started, which is honestly the part that should worry anyone still relying on a swarm-based strategy going forward. The Navy had been building toward exactly this scenario since 2021, running repeated exercises specifically to test unmanned systems and push toward a real, standing robotic fleet instead of a handful of prototypes sitting in a lab somewhere. These boats were tested for years, including alongside actual manned destroyers, refining exactly the kind of teamwork between humans and machines that ended up being so effective once this conflict finally broke out for real. And it wasn't a flawless story either, which honestly makes it more impressive. There were real technical failures along the way, collisions during testing, software problems, reliability issues that slowed the program down more than once. This wasn't some lucky overnight success dreamed up in a panic after Iran closed the strait. It was a difficult, multi-year engineering effort that hit real setbacks and kept getting refined anyway, right up until the exact moment it was needed most, when it finally proved itself in a real fight against a real determined enemy instead of just a training exercise. There's a lesson buried in that timeline that goes way beyond this one conflict. The systems that ended up saving the day weren't built in a panic. They were built years earlier, quietly, by people who had no idea exactly when or how they'd be needed. Only that someday, somehow, they probably would be. That's the difference between reacting to a threat and preparing for one long before it fully arrives. Iran spent 20 years perfecting a weapon for a war they assumed would look a certain way. The other side spent roughly the same amount of time quietly building an answer for a war that hadn't happened yet. When the moment actually came, one side was improvising under pressure, and the other side was simply executing a plan they had already rehearsed. So let's step back for a second and really think about why Iran's swarm doctrine, something that had worked as a genuine deterrent for years, fell apart this fast once it actually got tested for real. Because the swarm was never actually designed to defeat the United States Navy outright. Nobody in Tehran ever seriously believed 100 small boats could sink a full carrier strike group through raw numbers alone. That was never the real goal. The real purpose of the swarm was always about cost and fear. Making any attempt to challenge Iranian control of the strait expensive enough, chaotic enough, and risky enough that anyone thinking about it would hesitate. It's a strategy built on pressure as much as actual fighting power, and that kind of strategy works brilliantly, right up until the moment your opponent decides the cost of tearing it apart is worth paying and shows up with exactly the right combination of tools to do it methodically instead of trying to match you boat for boat. And that's exactly what Iran got wrong. They spent 20 years preparing for a fight against human sailors, human pilots, human decision makers who could be overwhelmed, confused, and slowed down by sheer numbers. What they actually faced was something that never gets tired, never panics, and never runs out of patience. Machines that watch every cove, every inlet, every quiet stretch of water, 24 hours a day, for as long as it takes. The scariest part of this whole story isn't the bombs or the boats or the missiles. It's how fast it all happened. A doctrine built over 20 years, unraveled in a matter of days, the moment it finally met an opponent who had quietly, patiently built the exact right answer years in advance and simply waited for the moment to use it. And this matters far beyond the Persian Gulf. Every country watching this conflict unfold took notes. Every navy on Earth that has ever leaned on cheap, fast, disposable boats as a way to punch above its weight just watched that entire strategy get dismantled in days by an opponent who simply refused to fight on the terms it was designed for. That's not a small regional lesson. That's a signal flare for anyone still betting their entire coastal defense on overwhelming human attention. The age of trying to outcrowd a warship with speedboats may not be completely over, but it just got a lot shorter than anyone in Tehran expected. Iran built a navy to fight people, and people, it turns out, were never really the target anymore. The next time someone tries to close a choke point with a swarm of small boats, they won't just be facing sailors on a bridge trying to track 50 contacts at once. They'll be facing something that never blinks, never sleeps, and never runs out of patience. And that changes everything about what a swarm can actually accomplish. If this story genuinely surprised you, that's exactly why we make these videos. Smash that like button, drop a comment with your biggest takeaway, and subscribe if you want more deep dives like this one delivered straight to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.